Hi, and welcome to the Auspoll video channel here at the Independence. Today I'm having a chat to Adam Jacoby. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, thanks for having me. Lovely to be here.
The third one or the fourth one that we're doing, so we're still learning. For those watching live on Crowdcast, feel free to ask questions in the comments, although I can't guarantee we'll get to all of them. We aim to be able to do the same for those watching on the Facebook and Twitter feeds, but presently we haven't got the capacity to do that. But wherever you are watching us, thank you. Now, Adam is the founder of MiVote and also been involved with other startups and other entrepreneurial activities. You seem like a busy man with many interests, Adam.
I'm reasonably busy. I have some interests, probably no more or less than anybody else. I probably tend to annoy other people more with my interests than most people do, but such is life, I guess.
Yeah, we kind of do that. Denise and I tend to talk about, where do you draw the line in terms of your sort of the social circle, talking about what we're passionate about. And as someone who writes and talks about democracy reform myself, I'm particularly interested in your MiVote initiative. And although we want to cover more than that in this chat, could you just give us a synopsis of what MiVote is and particularly what you're wanting and hoping to achieve with it?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on MiVote because I've done so many AMAs and so much media about it. And people, particularly in Auspoll, a number of people kind of know what at least the gist of it is. But in essence, it's a renewed version of the way democracy should work. We spent several years at the front end researching the intent of democracy, what it was meant to deliver citizens, where it was going wrong, where the erosion points had taken place, where technology was able to enhance some of those intended deliverables, and then kind of reconstructed the nature of the policy formation process so that it ensured that the practice of politics was actually being more democratic, because we have very little democracy, but we have a hell of a lot of politics. And our interest is in a more genuine democracy. It's underpinned by a blockchain voting system, but the voting system isn't about electoral voting. So we have no interest in who gets elected and how they get elected. What we're interested in is how policy is formed, whether people are appropriately informed of that policy, ensuring that there is equality of voice across the community so that everybody's voice is heard and counted. And then there are representatives who are held accountable to listening to the people. That's our interest.
Right. So is there technology? There's obviously technology involved, but it's more about the actual process of decision making. So in essence, then not necessarily confined to democracy as such. Is that right?
Well, look, it certainly could be extrapolated out to larger spaces. It's worth saying that we don't. The technology is at arm's length to the MiVote movement. So whilst it was born here, we spun out a company called Horizon State that we don't have any part of. We don't own. We don't operate. We're not on the board. We have no say whatsoever. We're a user like lots of other companies and governments are now users. But most of the time, what I find, there are two conversations. There is the technology conversation, which is how the blockchain is used and so forth, the cybersecurity component, the protecting anonymity of voters component, and then there's the MiVote conversation. And the MiVote conversation is much more about the philosophy of democracy and the operating model of democracy. So how do we go from taking a wicked societal challenge and deploying it into a policy setting that is usable, that is manageable, that is deployable, so that we actually have better community outcomes that are driven by all the voices in the community. So most of the conversations I have with political parties, with politicians, with heads of state at conferences are actually about the formation process. Very, very rarely do I ever talk about the technology. A, because I'm not a technologist, but B, because actually that part of the conversation doesn't interest me.
Right. And what kind of response are you getting?
Look, it's been mixed. In some parts of the world, it's been extraordinary. So, we've presented at the World Economic Forum, we've presented at Stanford University, we've met with multiple governments all over the world, several heads of state. There are a number of people, a number of governments, a number of elected officials who have a genuine interest in this conversation. They want to get better at representing their constituents. They want to find a more democratic path forward. But equally, there are a lot of countries where there is no interest, and there are a lot of parties where they have no interest in that. And, you know, as we've always said, we will hold the hands of those who want to make it better and help wherever we can, try and educate them about a better path, and even, you know, give them technology to do it if they're interested. And they're particularly in India and the UK, US, Canada, there are places where there's quite a bit of interest. Some sections of Australia, there's some interest, but those who aren't interested in ensuring that there's equality, that money's taking out of politics, that there's transparency and accountability, well, we reserve the right to be slightly more combative about the way we go about, you know, having a conversation about democracy.
Yeah, yeah. In one of the presentations I saw that you may have done a while ago, you also talked about the dichotomy of party politics, and how, and it's a sentiment I really agree with, is how, to me, party politics is what gets in the way of true democracy in a lot of ways.
Well,
and you see that as one of the obstacles?
Absolutely. You know, to me, probably second only to having an informed constituency, the single greatest threat to a genuinely democratic outcome are political parties. You know, political parties are predicated on the idea that they are espousing a particular ideology, which is a particular solution to whatever problems are in front of us. But a solutions orientation, which, you know, is prevalent in business and science, is about using the facts, understanding the ecosystem in its true form, and then extracting the best path as a result of that information, would take you on a very different path. It's no longer about what I believe and what I feel and what I think and what my ideology says. It actually says, what does the information tell us? What does the data say? And based upon what the data says, then we have a series of pathways by which we can go down, if we have a collective understanding of what, you know, good for the community looks like and what our value sets are. So things like the fact that we don't have a human rights charter, I think, is a massive problem for Australia, because it makes us much more susceptible to ideological perversions on both sides of the aisle, because you don't have this grounding document that says, hang on, fundamentally, to be an Australian protects these rights. And then within that margin, we can talk about what the particular policy outcomes could look like, where, you know, we go from so far left and so far right all the time. We're rarely grounded in, well, what's the starting point? And can we just agree that the data is the data? And we can't even agree that the data is the data. So it's a bit of a problem.
That's right. Well, we're in violent agreement on a lot of those things, Adam. And when I talk about democracy reform, one of the first questions I get asked is invariably, that all sounds great, but how do we make those changes? And, you know, that is really the biggest challenge. It's easy to look at what we can do, but the custodians of the systems are the politicians whose vested interest in not making these kinds of changes. Have you got any thoughts on sort of how do we make this happen on a bigger scale? How do we make these changes real?
Jesus, Kim, could you ask a more difficult question early on? Look, I mean, that's the $64 million question at the moment, isn't it? I think, and I think, look, for people on the left of politics, of which, you know, I'm certainly consider myself on the fringes of the progressive side, right at the end, pushing hard up against, but equally fully commit to ensuring that everybody has a voice, whether I agree with their voice or not. I think what's really important is, for the left of politics, I think the last election results in Australia was both a shock and probably fairly demoralising, because what my sense of the expectation was, being pretty intimately involved in Auspol and speaking to people deeply within the system for a long time, is that, you know, there was an agenda for fairly significant reform. That agenda was hijacked by a narrative and by a system that does not require delivery of best outcome for the vast majority of the constituency. And so where you have a system that can hijack the media, that can hijack the narrative, that can have 87 breaches of electoral law on election day, according to the AEC, that allows people to buy preferences, which is exactly what Palmer did for the Liberal Party. You know, you have a system that's broken, and not just broken, but it's difficult to start creating the change, because it's actually no longer a contest of ideas. It's actually now a contest of assets. and independent of whether or not you have the best idea and whether or not the idea that you have is best for the most people in the country, if you can't reach most people to have that conversation, you can't win. So, I have very frankly said to the Labor Party already, to members within the Labor Party who I've spoken to since the election, I don't know how you ever win an election again. And it's not that you're not worthy of winning an election, and it's not that you don't have ideas that aren't worthy of people being excited about, but you have zero control of the narrative. You have 80% of the media in this country owned by a person who fundamentally disagrees with you. And you have what used to be a group of objective constituents who are starting to become much less able to present your side, or they're brandished, biased, which is the greatest hypocrisy of all time, because the other side is 100% biased. But if another view is presented, all of a sudden we have to pull funding and shut the bloody place down. And I don't know how you defeat that if you intend to play the game as the game has been played. I think to win, the progressive side, the left side of politics, needs to be much more creative, both in the way that it uses and deploys media, in the way that it uses and deploys human assets, the ability for people, activists like you, like me, and the hundreds and hundreds of others in Ozpol who are going, things need to change, how do we make them change? But I think much more importantly, and what's interesting for me is watching how the Democratic Party is going through the process at the moment in the US. And you have the old guard of the Democratic Party in very public stoushes with the new guard of the Democratic Party. And, what's best and what's right, that depends upon your particular flavor of ideology. But the reality is that the old guard is saying, no, we need to try and take the center, win at the margins, support the base. And you've got the new guard going, but the base no longer represents the vast majority of the people, because the reality is that the younger generations coming up are interested in different things, and nobody's having a conversation with those people. They don't have a voice most of the time. The media isn't geared to them, and it's not designed to speak to them. And so those people go unheard. People in the margins of the minorities, our Indigenous community, have no voice, none. And so, if you go into Arnhem Land and you look around what's going on there, we spend a lot of money. We put a lot of money there. But capital isn't necessarily the thing that will make a difference here. We need representatives. We need candidates who actually speak for their communities and who are having dialogue with the broadest possible community groups and community members, so that when they come and say, this is the position I'm going to take on a piece of policy, it is informed by what their community actually wants them to do. We also need
rather than the other way around.
We also need a system that holds them fucking accountable to it, because it's one thing to go, I hear what your concern is, but I'm not going to listen to you, and it's my prerogative to do what I want because you elected me to represent you. It's quite another to go, well, hang on a second, you're paid by taxpayer-funded money. You work for us. Your only job is to represent our will. And if we've told you what our will is, then our expectation is that you will deliver it. And if you don't, you simply won't have a job.
So is what in essence that people's movement?
The what, sorry?
It has to be a people's movement.
100%.
Yeah.
And to me, it has to be led by independents. And this is the interesting thing. I've had a lot of conversations all over the country since the election. And people talk about, people who decry some of the stuff around the Senate and the fact that people get elected from non-traditional political parties, and how that's such a big problem for the community. It's only a problem for the community if the people who are voted from outside the major parties are beholden to a different set of stakeholders other than their constituents. But when we look at independents who are really engaging, who build community groups, who do a lot of, kitchen table meetings, who are deeply entrenched in the views of that community, that's what democracy is meant to be about. It's meant to be about genuine representatives. And to stop the hard lurch to the right, and I'll use the word, I know Denise likes to use the word as well, we are seeing the beginnings of fascism, and that is not hyperbole by any stretch of the imagination. When that starts to happen and you start to see massive data surveillance, scapegoating of minorities, militarization and authoritarian police forces, when you start to see an us and them in terms of the poor and the rich, so that the legislative line is very clearly in favour of the people who can most afford to pay for those outcomes, which is what we're seeing now in Australia, then all of a sudden you have this situation where we as a constituency have moved away from being able to deliver, because you can't trust the major parties to deliver the outcome that the community wants. But you don't need to circumvent that direction, or to, for that matter, just to disrupt it completely, in my opinion. And I may be very, very wrong, and I may be a bit delusional, but I would put to you that you don't need to have an alternative party to compete against the incumbents. You need to have 25 outstanding independents in key vulnerable seats, because once you win those 25 independent seats in the lower house, no party can govern. All of a sudden, the circuit breaker on policy are those 25 communities who actually have a real dialogue with their representatives, and will be a lot closer to delivering policy outcomes that represent the people. And once you see 20 to 25 seats where independents are there, the rest of the communities will start going, well, actually, that's a much better system. I don't need to vote Labor or Liberal.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and an interesting way to look at it in terms of how to affect that change. And I certainly agree that part of the solution is to get independent candidates on board and get people to understand what independent candidates actually do. One of the things that I've seen from, I come from Norway originally, which probably has a better functioning democracy on some levels. It's certainly not ideal at all, but over the last 30 or 40 years, the dominance of the major parties have disappeared, as they have in many, many European countries.
Yep.
And in many European countries, it has led to a much more consensus-driven model. It is still a top-down model, but at least it is more consensus-driven. We certainly see that in Scandinavia. People always then throw back at me when I say, well, what about Italy? Well, they'll have to sort out their own problems. That's a different issue. Really, what we're seeing with the fragmentation of parties, and we're starting to see it now in Australia. But parties are not going to go away by themselves, are they? So what else have you seen on your travels and discussing with people outside of Australia? Are there democracies that really work in the way we'd like to think it could work?
No. The short answer is no.
Yeah.
But for me, it's not even about that there aren't democracies that are working. It's that I would put to you, and this is the book that I'm writing at the moment, I would put to you that there has never been democracy. No human being has ever experienced real democracy. And people go, well, what about, the Greeks? Well, that's great, but the people who were allowed to vote were all men, and they were landowners. So that wasn't democratic either. So,
yep.
There has never been a system that we have used on scale in any country ever where everybody had an equal voice, that was informed by the facts, that allowed a single vote, and that required the representative to actually enact the will of those people. We've never had it. And so, is democracy the system that we need as a human species? I don't know. But until we've tried it, I'm not prepared to give up on it. And once we've seen it in its genuine form, or close to genuine form, then we can make a determination if in fact we've gone the wrong direction and we need to think about something else.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. It's almost like you read the introduction to my own book. But I keep coming back to the question. The other question I often get, and I'm sure you do too, is: are these changes even possible without some form of people revolt, even a revolution? Is people power alone going to be enough?
Yeah,
or is the apathy so entrenched that a real shake-up is needed to demand change? It scares me.
I'm a big believer in the importance of language, and the way that language is moderated, particularly in this space. I had a question. I was giving a speech in London last year at the World. Sorry, it wasn't last year. It was the year before, at the World's Top 50 Innovators Conference. And somebody asked me almost the identical question about, is it going to take revolution? And my response then, and I still feel, conviction around this answer now, is that it absolutely will take a revolution, but not in the definition that I think you're using. So, why do we have to assume that revolution needs to be bloody? Why does it need to be upheaval in a major way? Technical disruption is revolution. having a situation where representatives say, I'm not going to stand for a party and I'm going to ask your opinion on every policy is a revolution. It is a revolutionary idea to go against the entrenched mechanisms of the system and say, I'm going to do it differently. So yes, there is no way this is going to change unless there's revolution. But the revolution is not going to be the way it was in the 1700s, where we start lopping off heads. The revolution is going to be lopping off parts of the system that don't make sense anymore.
Yeah, yeah. And you think that's doable?
I think it's inevitable. And I think it is the only way as a species we can move forward, because we can't keep going down the road that we're going, or we're going to be back in the times where there is a ruling class and everybody else are slaves to them. And I don't mean that, like, again, it sounds kind of hyperbolic, but if we look at where we're going, we are seeing, erosion after erosion after erosion of the voice and the rights of the working class. And so you have this situation where there are genuinely two tiers in the community. There are the people who make decisions and everybody else who slaves all day long to enrich those people. And the legislation that we're seeing is starting to support those outcomes. And again, I'm not suggesting that people who have money are evil. And I'm also not suggesting that money is evil necessarily in and of itself. It's evil depending upon what you do with it, like anything. And listen, I've been a businessman for 25 years, and I've been the CEO of the BRW fastest growing private company in the country. I'm not anti-business, but what I am 100% for is genuine democracy based on equity and some kind of underlying value within the community that says it's not okay that you can have billionaires who can create policy outcomes to further enrich themselves when we have tens of thousands of homeless kids on the street. That in a country as sophisticated and intelligent and wealthy as Australia, that is not acceptable as an outcome. And we shouldn't judge ourselves. And I think part of the mistake that countries make is we love talking about ourselves based upon GDP, and we love talking about ourselves based upon how many billionaires we have, and we love talking about ourselves about whether we're in the G8 and we're in the G20. How many people are homeless? How many people don't have food? How many people can't get educated? How many people don't have access to internet? These are the things that should be determining how successful a country we are. And that's where Scandinavia has done it much better than anybody else in the world.
Yes. Yes, that's very true. And that model is largely accepted, even amongst the billionaires. I'm not saying there isn't a degree of haves and have-nots by any stretch, but generally it is an acceptance that government needs to be for the people and not just for those that can influence decisions.
Yeah.
But coming back to Australia, one of the other challenges that I see as big obstacles to real change, and we're seeing it just today when yet another case came up about Section 44 and dual citizenship, which again is a complete distraction and in so many ways completely irrelevant. I mean, whether you like Frydenberg and the work he does or not, he was born in this country.
Yep.
He should be absolutely eligible to be elected. He should also follow the law, but the law is wrong.
Yep. Couldn't agree.
The Constitution is an anachronism, and our politicians are so afraid of even change. And I think of all people that have dared to voice suggesting that this should change was Barnaby Joyce.
Yep.
And of course, with a certain self-interest in that suggestion, but to me that's okay. This whole dichotomy of changing the Constitution is so hard, so we don't even try. How do we get around that?
Yeah, look, this is such a fascinating conversation. I think you get around it by acknowledging that it no longer is fit for purpose. So, to give you a sense, my grandmother is 102 years old. When you talk to my grandmother about the world that she grew up in, literally everything about that world has changed. Transport, travel, industry, education, how you bloody cool your food. Literally everything in her life is different. We govern ourselves in the same bloody way. So we are using a system that was designed for a world that no longer exists and expect that it is still fit for purpose. It's lunacy, right? So I think we need to just acknowledge that we've moved beyond what that founding document was meant to do. and we need a revamp. And it's the same conversation I've written about this with regards to the Constitution in the US. You know, the US has a constitutional crisis now, but the crisis is not what people think. I mean, it has several crises, but the main crisis has been brought to bear by the gun violence situation. And you have this incredible situation where what is the most famous democracy in the world, although it's not a real democracy, is challenged because the majority of people, by every survey and every poll for the last multiple years, want some form of gun reform on automatic weapons. And yet the Constitution enshrines the right to have no gun reform. And so you have this situation where the Constitution is now against the majority will of the people. Their own documentation can't serve the people. And that's the document that is meant to deliver the democracy itself. So we have moved to an age that none of these founding constitutional documents could ever have imagined. The technological capability we have, the global connectedness of people, the way that we trade, the instantaneous way that finance works and comms work. We weren't prepared. We couldn't foresee any of it. We have to start changing our ruling and governing and policy systems to accommodate for those things. And a government who's not prepared to do this, and this is, you know, the dig that I like to continually have about the Conservative Party, is we live in the most progressive time in human history, and yet there are parties calling themselves conservatives whose entire ideology is based on stasis. How could you possibly advocate for doing nothing in a world that is moving so fast that you can't already keep up with it? If you're not prepared to even try and keep up with it, on what basis can you ask for people to vote for you? It's insane. But that's where we are.
That is where we are. And you know, the other place we are is that, you know, you and I and many other listeners can agree violently on all of this, and we probably do. And then we keep, apart from constitutional change, the other thing that we keep bumping up against is media. And a lot of people, and you mentioned it before, you know, we have extreme media concentration in this country. With what I'm seeing, with what I'm doing with the independents, is that it is changing, but it's all too slowly.
Well, it's not that it's. But I don't know that it's the pace. I think it's the reality of the asset pool. So I think if there were wealthy progressive people who understood the damage to the democracy that was being done by the consolidation of our media. We have the most consolidated media in the entire world, bar none. To have the diversity of voice, which is just an underlying principle of democracy anyway, even if you didn't change anything else in the system, but you ensure that there were multiple ways and multiple thoughts that people could hear on a daily basis, rather than having towns and areas where only one paper exists and that paper is pushing a particular agenda. If there were wealthy progressives who came back and said, that is worth fixing, and it will save the country if we did nothing else but that, and there was money set aside to create a whole suite of progressive media entities that were unashamedly progressive. So not like the ABC that has to, understandably, because it's taxpayer funded, draw the line of balance, which it should absolutely do under its charter. But you've got the Murdochracy, which is very clearly taking a position, but there is no alternative to their position that has the same kind of financial strength. And so I think it takes a few things. It takes people like you to start the exact programs that you're doing. So kudos to you. Well done. A really important start. We need people who have the means to say, I'm prepared to put in a few $1 million to make sure that things like you're doing are heard by people all over the country, that there are regular channels, that it can be done with high production value, and that it can genuinely compete. And then I think the other thing is that people need to stand up and start saying, although I find politics abhorrent, I love my community and I have a place in my community and people listen to me, and I'm going to stand up and run as an independent, and I'm going to make a promise to them that I'm going to represent their view. And if that's the case, MiVote will give you the tools to be able to do it, and we'll give it to you for nothing. And that's kind of also opens up a whole different discussions about different levels of government, which is possibly something we can have a discussion about some other time, because we are starting to get towards the end of our allotted half hour. But just on that note, I saw something very encouraging in my inbox today, and which I know has been happening, but it's now been announced. The Judith Nielsen Institute for Journalism and Ideas have now announced properly, and they're seeking submissions. It's a $100 million fund, amazing,
which is great. John B. Fairfax, not to be confused with the current Fairfax owners, but the older Fairfax owner is doing something different, something similar.
There's another one called PIGI, which is the Public Interest Journalism Initiative,
yes.
with some really high-profile people involved in that. But yeah, it's starting to happen.
Yes,
but
also it needs to happen fast. But the encouraging thing that I'm seeing from independent media is that the growth is actually explosive in terms of readership. So it's still small numbers, relatively speaking, but the growth is really happening.
But let me tell you what one of my concerns is, and this is so projecting out now 5, 6, 7, 10 years. It's wonderful that we will have a whole new ecosystem of independent media, or even progressive media, if you want to call it that. My fear is that because there are now these endowments and there are now these initiatives and there are, all sorts of grant situations, is that we will be such a splintered group again that coming together becomes difficult. And the left is remarkably consistent at shooting itself in the foot. We are very bloody good at it, right? The fact that the Greens and the ALP could not settle their differences, they would rather lose elections than win an election and have to compromise something, is the most ridiculous situation and infuriating situation in the Australian left of politics. But my fear is the same thing could happen with media, that if we start to have 5, 10, 15 different groups, what we don't have is a unified alternative to the Conservatives. What we saw with the Liberal Party, they don't care who they get votes from. They don't care if it's Palmer. They don't care if it's One Nation. They don't care how abhorrent you've got young Nazis coming up in the National Party. They don't care. They want to win. The only thing they care about is winning. We do not know how to win on the left. We know how to be virtuous, and we know how to think for other people. We know how to be concerned and compassionate and empathetic, but we don't know how to win. And we've got to learn how to win, and it's not going to be the way we've been doing it for the last 20, 30, 40 years.
It's not just with red banners running down the street, is it? That's not really going to work.
No.
Adam, and it's been a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it. I think we should try and reconvene again and continue some of these discussions. But I think we share a fundamental optimism. And I know you like bold predictions. So what would that be? You're much younger than me, but can you see profound changes happening in my lifetime, or at least in yours?
So I gave a prediction at that same conference I was talking about, the World's Top 50 conference. They require you to give a bold prediction. I'll give the same one that I gave them, and I'll give some nuance to it as well. I would say that within 25 years, every country that claims to be a democracy will, to some degree, be a direct democracy. It will be inevitable that technology will require you to speak to the people about policy. Whether or not politicians then hold themselves to account to those answers, that'll be on a country-by-country basis. But what you will start to see is a much greater engagement of the constituency on policy matters. And I can tell you now, because I'm in the middle of the conversations, there are multiple countries that are looking to do it. So I think it's just going to take one or two to show how it works and show that, in fact, it's not as dangerous as they would have you believe. And the results are actually much more harmony, much less tribalism, and then we'll start to see that flow. But the other thing that I think you're going to see is an uprising, a bold prediction, an uprising of the younger generations. And I mean that in a really significant way, that over the course, probably not next election, but the election after that and the one after that, you'll start to see a lot of very young people running for seats who are very well informed, who are very passionate about their community, who have the tools and the understanding of what it takes to win, who understand the mechanisms of media and social media much better than the incumbent parties. And we will start to see a hell of a lot of young people winning seats in Parliament.
That's a great note to finish on, Adam. It's good to have some optimism into this sometimes rather depressing conversation. So thank you to Adam Jacoby. You can find him on mivote.com and of course on Twitter at Adam A. Jacoby. This broadcast will soon be available to watch on our YouTube channel, and please check out independence.org.au, our independent media portal, which is updated today. And at the moment we have force of news and commentary. Thank you for watching, and thank you, Adam.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Kim. Take care.